He only stepped away for a few hours, but came home to a door left ajar, a house too quiet, and a mother who hadn't made her morning tea. His German shepherd, Boone, froze mid-step, ears back, body low, before leading him straight into a silence that would change everything. Some stories begin with a scream. This one started with a whisper and a paw pressed gently to a trembling hand. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and stay until the end, because sometimes the softest stories carry the heaviest truths. Type Amen if you believe loyalty can save a life. The rain had come earlier than expected that year in Joseph, Oregon. It hadn't started loud, just a quiet tapping against the windshield, soft and even, like fingers drumming to an old, forgotten song. Officer Nolan Briggs sat behind the wheel of his patrol vehicle, its heater murmuring low against the foggy chill. In the back seat, Boone stirred but didn't lift his head. His eyes, the color of worn oak, remained half-closed, his breath steady. They had driven that road 100 times, back from the edge of Shift, down the winding stretch of 82 past the lake. But something about that afternoon felt out of place. Not urgent, not loud, just off. The sky was the color of bruised steel, heavy and slow, sagging low over the pine-covered hills. The kind of sky that made time feel thick. A faint trail of wood smoke curled from someone's chimney, curling and dissolving before it reached the clouds. Somewhere a dog barked once, distant and sharp. Boone's ears twitched, but he didn't rise. Nolan glanced in the rearview. Boone blinked. That was enough. It was the kind of exchange they'd grown used to over 10 years together. No commands, no gestures, just a look, a presence. He turned off the highway onto a gravel road lined with maples beginning to rust into their October gold. The tires crackled over wet stone and Boone finally sat up. He didn't whine, didn't move, just sat, watching the curve in the road ahead like he always did when they neared home. Home. That word meant something different now. It wasn't where Nolan lived anymore, hadn't been for over 2 decades, but it was where she still was, in the cabin at the edge of town, tucked under a slope of trees that once whispered with his father's voice. Nolan had meant to visit earlier that week. He'd called instead, a short conversation like most of theirs. His mother had asked if he wanted pear cobbler. He said he was on shift. She'd said she understood, and they'd hung up. He hadn't thought about it again, until now. Boone stood up as the cabin came into view. The porch light was off. Nolan's foot eased off the gas. The house sat quiet, too quiet, its cedar siding damp with rain, windows dulled by condensation. The flower pots near the front step had tipped over, one cracked open, dirt bleeding onto the wood. Boone let out a low, muted sound. Not quite a growl, more like uncertainty. Nolan killed the engine. Neither moved for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up. Rain danced sideways, catching in the branches. A rusted wind chime swung gently near the porch beam, but made no sound. Nolan stepped out first. The ground gave slightly beneath his boots, soft from the season's first soaking. Boone followed without hesitation, hopping down from the cruiser and landing with a quiet thump. The first thing Nolan noticed, no smell. His mother's house always smelled like something baking. Cinnamon, apples, that honey oat bread she made and left on neighbors' porches wrapped in brown paper. Today, the air smelled only of wet earth and pine. He approached the steps slowly. Boone moved beside him, shoulders tight, head low, every sense alert. The front door was closed, but not latched. It swung slightly with the wind, not enough to open, but enough to whisper. Nolan reached out, touched the handle. Cold. He pushed. The door creaked open. Darkness greeted them. The living room was dim, curtains drawn. No lamp. No radio. No fire in the hearth. The quilt usually folded over the sofa had slipped onto the floor, as if someone had left in a hurry or been taken by surprise. And then, the clock. That old mantel clock, a wedding gift from the 1970s, ticked steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Each second like a breath held too long. It was the only sound in the room. Boone stepped in ahead. His nails tapped softly against the wood floor. His body moved low, but with purpose. Nose to the ground, ears twitching. Nolan followed. His eyes scanned everything. The picture frames still hung in place. Family photos faded from sun and time. Her cardigan was still draped over the arm of the chair. The tea mug sat cold on the table, half full, untouched. Boone stopped. He looked back at Nolan. Not barking, not panicked, just waiting. The kind of look that said, "Come see, now." Nolan's stomach tightened. He moved past the kitchen, the scent of something faintly burnt. A tray of cookies, overbaked and forgotten, still sat inside the oven. The hallway was darker, the air colder. And Boone didn't hesitate. He padded forward and turned toward the narrow door at the end of the hall, the basement storage room. Nolan hadn't opened that door in years. It always stuck, always creaked. He reached for the knob, hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from knowing. From knowing when something isn't right. The door was ajar. Boone was already waiting. The door to the storage room opened with a reluctant groan, its hinges resisting like an old man asked to rise too quickly. The hallway behind Nolan dimmed further, as if even the daylight outside didn't want to follow him in. Boone entered first, his body tense but certain, moving low and slow through the threshold. Nolan didn't call him back. He trusted Boone the way a man trusts gravity, without thinking, without question. The room was colder than the rest of the house. It smelled faintly of bleach and wet cardboard. The bulb overhead had burned out years ago and never been replaced. Nolan reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt and clicked it on. The beams sliced through the dark, landing on shelves of old tins, dusty jars, boxes marked with faded ink. Christmas, Nolan's baby clothes, Bill's books. His father's name. That ache was always there, tucked beneath every memory in that house. Boone moved without sound to the far corner of the room. There was a set of narrow stairs leading down to the root cellar, once used for potatoes and apples. No one went down there anymore, except Boone. He stood at the top, nose lifted, ears angled back. His body didn't bark, didn't move. It pointed. Nolan didn't breathe. He stepped forward, slow as water creeping toward a crack. The wood creaked beneath his weight. The door to the cellar was open a finger's width, just enough for the light to spill through and catch something on the floor, just enough to notice the shift in air. He pushed it open. There was a sound that didn't belong, a soft scraping, barely audible, like cloth against concrete. Then the light landed on her. His mother. Marla Briggs was on the floor near the back wall, slumped onto one hip, her wrists pulled tight in front of her with a plastic zip tie, her ankles bound the same. A kitchen towel, checked blue and white, was wrapped once around her mouth, knotted behind her head. Her hair, once silver and neat, was tangled, her cardigan askew, her breath shallow. But she was awake. Her eyes were open wide, shining with something that wasn't fear anymore. It was recognition. The flashlight slipped from Nolan's hand and rolled, beams spiraling along the walls before settling into a quiet corner. He dropped to his knees. "Mom." But he didn't finish the word. His hands were already at the knot, his fingers trembling, too rough, too urgent. Boone circled once, then stopped near her feet, lying down with his chest pressed flat to the ground. One paw reached out, lightly touched her hand. She flinched, then saw who it was. Boone stayed still. He didn't lick, didn't whine. He simply lay there, watching her, breathing with her, like he was trying to steady her own breath. Nolan freed her ankles first, then her wrists. Then gently, carefully, he untied the towel. She gasped once, like someone coming up from deep water. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes blinked in slow, confused rhythm. But still, she didn't speak. Her hands fluttered at her chest, fingers curling as if grasping for something invisible. He wrapped his arms around her and sat with her on the floor. She was lighter than he remembered. Small, like something made of paper and thread. She didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. The questions could come later. Right now, all that mattered was the way she leaned into him, just barely, like the instinct of a bird returning to a familiar branch. Boone lifted his head slightly, ears still scanning. Then he lowered it again. His tail lay flat, unmoving. There was no barking, no fight, but there was watchfulness, and Nolan trusted that more than anything. They sat like that a long time. Upstairs, the house remained still. The mantel clock ticked on. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, and then nothing at all. But down there, in the quiet dark beneath the house, Nolan held his mother as if she might vanish again, and Boone kept his eyes fixed on the stairwell like he knew the dark could still return. Later, when Nolan finally helped her up and out of the cellar, he wrapped a blanket over her shoulders and brought her to the worn armchair in the living room. He lit the fire not for heat, but for memory. He poured her water, sat on the edge of the hearth. She didn't speak. But when Boone walked over and laid his head on her lap, her hand found his fur and stayed. Nothing needed to be said yet, and Nolan didn't press her. Some truths arrive slowly, in silence, and only when the body feels safe enough to hold them. So he let the silence stay. Let Boone's breath fill the space between them. Let the fire crackle and the weight of unspoken things settle gently like dust in the afternoon light. And in that stillness, something unbroken began to stir. The house didn't feel like hers anymore. Marla hadn't moved from the armchair since Nolan brought her up from the cellar. The fire burned low, but the warmth reached just far enough to soften the air around her. A second blanket had been tucked around her legs. She held it close, not for heat, but for something to hold. Nolan watched her from the edge of the fireplace, boots planted on the worn rug, elbows on his knees. He didn't speak. Not because he didn't want to, but because there was nothing that could be said that wouldn't sound like a mistake. Boone lay beside her chair, chin resting flat on the hardwood, ears slightly back, his body still but humming with presence. Every so often, he'd lift his head and scan the room, nose twitching slightly, as if confirming that what had happened had truly left. Then he'd lower his head again, but never fully closed his eyes. Nolan eventually rose and moved toward the kitchen, not to eat, not to cook, but because stillness needed to break itself in small ways. He poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove, then paused, fingers still wrapped around the handle. Something felt off, not wrong exactly, just misaligned, like a picture frame that had been nudged a few degrees too far to the left. He stepped back into the living room and began to walk the house slowly, methodically. Not as a cop, not yet. Just as a son who knew the rhythm of this home, the creaks in the floor, the tilt of the window frames, the scent of vanilla that should have lingered on the curtains but didn't. The hallway was dim. The bulb in the overhead fixture had gone out at some point, and Nolan hadn't noticed until now. He passed by the linen closet. It was closed, but the edge of a towel poked out between the door and the frame, caught like it had been shut in a rush. He didn't touch it. In the guest bedroom, the bedspread was half pulled back, though the sheets remained untouched. On the floor near the foot of the bed, a pair of Marla's house slippers sat, not together, but apart. One was facing the window, the other turned sideways, as if it had been kicked off in a hurry. He crouched. The floor beneath one slipper had a faint scuff, a dark streak on the wood grain, subtle but new. When he rose, Boone was at the door, watching him. No bark, no signal. Just that same quiet tracking. Nolan moved past him into the den. The curtains were drawn, the room half in shadow. This had been his father's room once. After Bill died, Marla kept it mostly closed. Not as a shrine, just as a space she didn't need anymore. But the door had been open when he arrived. Not wide, just cracked. Enough for someone to slip in or out. He stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the old rotary phone, pulled from the wall, its wire dangling like a severed limb. The handset lay face down on the floor. He picked it up. The back was smudged, damp. He turned it in his hand, then set it back exactly as it was. The second thing he noticed was on the writing desk. A piece of paper, crumpled but not torn, tucked into the corner near a stack of faded recipe cards. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting wasn't hers. Rushed. Tilted. Heavy pressure on the pen strokes. Only 5 words. Stop asking about the mill. His chest tightened. Boone stepped further into the room, sniffing once near the base of the desk, then near the windowsill. Nolan followed the line of Boone's gaze. The latch on the window was unlocked. Not broken. Just open. The kind of detail that wouldn't catch the eye if you didn't know she always kept them locked at night. And Nolan knew. Every window, every habit, every turn of his mother's daily routine. He moved through the rest of the house slower now, eyes catching things he hadn't noticed in the first sweep. A dish towel thrown under the sink. The back door's lock scraped slightly, as if someone unfamiliar had fumbled with it. The porch light bulb missing, gone, not broken. The walls of the house felt tighter now. Not claustrophobic, just altered, as if the air remembered something it didn't want to say. Back in the living room, the fire had faded to embers. Marla hadn't moved. She was holding Boone's ear gently between 2 fingers, her thumb stroking the fur just behind the bend where it never stood straight. He let her. Nolan crouched beside her. She looked at him, not startled, not even sad, just tired. Her eyes weren't asking for answers. They were offering something quieter. I'm still here. He nodded once, then looked at Boone. Boone met his eyes. His tail thumped once against the floor, slow and solid. It wasn't over, but it wasn't lost. Not yet. The fire had burned low again, more ash than flame now. But Nolan didn't get up to tend it. He sat cross-legged on the floor near his mother's chair, boots off, socks damp from where the kitchen floor had been slick with melted ice. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, forearms resting on his knees, hands laced loosely in front of him. His mother sat above him, silent still, wrapped in the same blanket from before. Boone lay at her feet, breath slow and steady, head resting on one outstretched paw, the other tucked under his chest. No one had spoken in almost an hour, and that was all right. Words weren't built for moments like this. Not when the soul was still catching up to the body. What Marla had been through would come out in pieces, or not at all. And Nolan had learned over time that silence wasn't always absence. Sometimes, it was the clearest kind of presence. Outside, the rain had eased. The wind had settled into the trees, letting the town return to the kind of quiet that only small places knew, where the hum of a refrigerator or the faint rustle of a curtain could feel like thunder. Nolan could hear the faint creak of the porch swing bumping against the wood post, its chain stretched by the breeze. The swing always moved after a storm. His father used to say it was the wind remembering how to rest. Nolan reached for the tea mug he'd poured earlier and took a sip. It had gone cold. He didn't mind. He set it back down, then pulled his phone from his back pocket and turned it over in his hand without unlocking it. Just holding it. He wasn't ready to make any calls. Not yet. But he would. There were things that needed looking into. Eventually, he stood and walked into the front hallway, the old floorboards gently protesting beneath him. Boone followed without being asked. He didn't move fast, didn't make a sound, just rose and came, his body forming the quiet shadow that always trailed Nolan's steps. Nolan reached for the landline on the small table near the door, the one his mother still used for all her calls, but the phone was missing. He stared at the empty spot for a moment, then slowly opened the drawer beneath. Inside, coiled like a sleeping snake, was the power cord, still connected to the receiver. The rest was gone. Just gone. He closed the drawer and exhaled. Someone planned this, he murmured, not to Boone, not even to himself, but into the space where realization lands before it can be named. He didn't need to know everything yet. But he knew enough. Someone had been in the house, not to steal, not to hurt, at least not physically. They had wanted to make something clear, without saying it out loud. Boone turned his head toward the front window and let out a short, low grunt. Not a bark, just a breath pressed through his throat with weight behind it. Nolan stepped up beside him and moved the curtain an inch with his fingertip. Nothing. The town was still. The neighbor's truck parked crooked near the curb. The mailboxes dry now under the porch awnings, a single street lamp flickering in the distance. He checked the deadbolt, then the latch. Both were secure. Still, Boone didn't move. His tail was stiff. His body leaned slightly forward. Not alert, just aware. Nolan pressed the curtain closed again and turned back toward the living room. He passed by the hallway that led to the back bedrooms and stopped in front of a framed photograph. His parents on their front porch, maybe 20 years younger. His mother's hair was darker, her eyes sharper. His father standing behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. There was something in that picture that struck him now. The way his father looked at her, as if he knew she carried more than she ever let show. Nolan reached into his pocket and finally unlocked his phone. He tapped through his contacts until he found Hadley. Officer Dan Hadley had worked beside him for nearly a decade, the kind of man who said little but remembered everything. He didn't call, just sent a message. Need camera pulls near Mom's, 2:06 p.m. today. Don't log it. He didn't wait for a reply. Hadley would understand. Some things were better handled in quiet ways. Back in the kitchen, Boone had moved to the rear door and was sniffing near the baseboard. Nolan walked over and saw what the dog had already noticed. The door had been locked from the inside, but just above the handle, the wood was scratched, not gouged, not splintered, but worn in a way that didn't match any of his mother's habits. It was the kind of scratch that came from gloved fingers, steady pressure, a slow twist of something metal. Boone sat down beside the door. just sat, watching Nolan. And that was when Nolan saw it. Not something large, not something loud. Just a small, square piece of paper, no bigger than a matchbook, slid just beneath the refrigerator's edge. He crouched, reached, pulled it free. On one side, a grainy photo of the Millfield sawmill taken from the front gate, sometime in late autumn, judging by the leaves on the ground. On the back, nothing. Blank. Nolan didn't speak. He looked at Boone. Boone blinked once, then stood. The questions hadn't formed yet. They didn't have names or shapes or sharp edges, but they were there, waiting. Morning came late in Joseph. Clouds sat low over the town, dragging their gray bellies across the tops of the Wallowa Mountains. The light that filtered through was thin and diffused, more suggestion than sun. A light breeze shook the wet branches, scattering cold droplets onto the porch roof like the ticking of an impatient clock. But inside Marla's house, time had slowed again, held in the hush that follows a long night. Nolan sat at the kitchen table, the same table he'd eaten thousands of quiet breakfasts at as a boy, boots still muddy from the woods, his father's flannel jacket drowning his arms. This morning the chair across from him was empty, and Boone lay beneath it, chin resting between his front paws, eyes following Nolan's every movement. Nolan didn't notice. His fingers moved slowly over the photograph he'd pulled from under the refrigerator. Millfield Sawmill. He hadn't thought of that place in years, and yet here it was, showing up like a ghost tucked beneath the floorboards. He flipped the photo again, still blank on the back. The edges were worn but not yellowed. It was recent, or at least handled recently. He remembered Millfield as a boy, the tall wire fence, the grinding sound of the saws, the way his father would come home smelling like cedar and sweat and metal filings. The mill had closed when Nolan was 15, shut down abruptly after a federal audit. But no one had ever said much. The rumors floated: financial mishandling, misreported injuries, undocumented workers. All of it became smoke, and then nothing. But Nolan remembered a different kind of silence back then. Not the silence of things being forgotten, but of things being buried. His father, usually open and patient, had grown withdrawn in those last 2 years before his death. There were nights he'd sit out on the porch long after Marla went to bed, a notebook in his lap, scribbling by the light of an old camping lantern. Nolan had seen it only once. His father had closed it quickly, offered a tired smile, and said, "Gotta keep the numbers honest." He never mentioned it again. Now Nolan wondered if that notebook still existed, and whether the silence in this house had always been sheltering something larger than grief. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, soft at first, then sharper. Nolan rose, turned off the flame, and poured water into the 2 mugs waiting on the counter. One was his mother's favorite, a white ceramic cup with a faded painting of a songbird perched on a pine branch. The other was plain gray, chipped at the rim. He didn't add sugar, didn't stir. He set both mugs on the table. Boone shifted slightly beneath him, but didn't rise. A soft knock on the front door startled them both. Not loud, not urgent, but strange in a town like Joseph. Unannounced visits before 8 a.m. were rare. Nolan moved to the door without speaking. Boone followed, body low and alert. Nolan kept one hand near the small of his back, not reaching for a weapon, just aware. He opened the door slowly. It was Mr. Calvin, the neighbor across the way. 76, retired, a quiet man with a limp from an old farming injury and a tendency to speak with long pauses between thoughts. "Sorry to bother," Calvin said, eyes flicking past Nolan's shoulder, then landing on Boone with something like respect. "Thought you might want to know," Saw a truck parked up near your drive yesterday evening. Late, engine off, no lights. Nolan's jaw tightened. What kind of truck? Red Ford, older, dented on the passenger side. Saw it once or twice around the mill years ago. Didn't think much of it at the time. The mill? Calvin nodded slowly, then looked down, as if embarrassed. I worked there. Not long. Just sorting inventory. Left before it shut down. A lot of folks left before it shut down. Nolan waited. Calvin cleared his throat. Your dad, he was a good man. Did right by a lot of people. But he asked questions some folks didn't want asked. He kept records. Don't know what he did with them. But they mattered. Boone let out a low, brief chuff, more breath than sound. Nolan nodded once, eyes steady. Thanks, Calvin. The old man hesitated. You ever need help? Don't ask out loud. Just leave your porch light on at noon. Then he turned and walked back across the wet gravel. Nolan stood there for a long time after the door closed, hand resting on Boone's head. He didn't pet him, didn't scratch behind the ear like he usually did. He just stood. Boone pressed into his leg slightly, steady as always. Later that afternoon, Nolan walked down into the basement. He hadn't been down there in years, not since after his father's funeral, when he and his mother boxed up everything too heavy to keep upstairs. Dust hung in the air like old breath. Cardboard boxes lined the far wall, each one labeled in his father's small, cramped handwriting. One read tax docs, another tool manuals. One near the back simply said ledger. He opened it. Inside, neatly stacked, were 3 black notebooks, spiral-bound, pages full of tidy columns, dates, figures, initials. Some names he didn't recognize. Some he did. One near the bottom margin of the second page stopped his breath. R.W., 12,500, Consulting. He didn't need to guess. There was only one man in the county with those initials, still serving on the planning commission, still smiling for local paper endorsements. Boone sat beside him, nose pointed at the door. They weren't done. The past wasn't dead. It had just been waiting to be reopened. It was the kind of morning where nothing moved unless it had to. A brittle sun had finally broken through the clouds, painting thin silver lines along the window frames. But the light felt borrowed, hesitant, as though Oregon wasn't quite ready to let go of the storm. The leaves clinging to the maples outside the house were turning, the yellows sharp, the reds bruised. Nolan stood at the sink rinsing dust from his father's old ledger books, not with water, but with a dry cloth, careful not to smudge the numbers. He hadn't opened the second or third one yet. The weight of what might be inside pressed just hard enough to keep his hand still. Across the kitchen, Boone sat facing the back door. He hadn't left that spot since breakfast. His posture wasn't tense, not exactly, but he was anchored there, as if the air held something he couldn't name but wouldn't ignore. The floor beneath him creaked every time he shifted his weight. Nolan had grown used to that sound, not just the creaking, but the way Boone's body responded to things long before they revealed themselves. The silence in Boone's bones had always been louder than most men's voices. Marla was resting in the living room. She hadn't spoken more than a few words since the night before, but her movements had become steadier, her hands less shaky. She had insisted on sitting by the window with a paperback in her lap. Not reading, just holding it, as if the act of having a book was enough to remind her who she was. Boone had stopped glancing in on her every 5 minutes, which told Nolan all he needed to know. Boone had accepted that she was safe, for now. Nolan stepped into the mudroom and opened the door to the garage, where his father's old tool bench still sat beneath a dusty window. It smelled like motor oil and rust and faint traces of cedar. He set the ledgers on the workbench and flipped open the second one. The pages were tighter, more crowded. The entries had shifted from neat rows to hastily drawn blocks of information. Names, dates, amounts, sometimes notes like witnessed or spoke in confidence, or once scrawled in the margin, "Keep this out of town records." Nolan turned the pages slowly, stopping on a folded slip of paper tucked between two blank ones. It was a receipt from a bar down in La Grande, dated 13 years ago, paid in cash, signed with the initials CM. That name meant nothing. Yet. Then Boone barked. One sharp, deliberate burst. Nolan froze. It wasn't a sound Boone made lightly, not startled, not aggressive. That single bark meant one thing: pay attention. He left the garage and stepped quickly back into the kitchen. Boone was already pacing, not frantically, but with purpose, nose low to the ground, tail straight out, body aligned with something Nolan couldn't yet see. Boone circled the kitchen table once, then crossed to the hallway leading to the guest room. He sniffed at the floor near the air vent, then at the baseboards, pausing just outside the closet door. His shoulders were stiff, but his movement stayed controlled. Nolan stepped closer. "What is it?" he whispered, not expecting an answer, just needing to give shape to the moment. Boone pressed his nose against the lower corner of the door and let out a low, guttural hum. Not fear. Not warning. Recognition. Nolan reached for the doorknob and slowly opened the closet. Nothing unusual at first. Coats, boxes of holiday decorations, a folded card table leaning against the back wall, but Boone stepped inside, pushing past his legs, and immediately began sniffing at the floor. After a moment, he stopped and scratched twice at the far left corner. Nolan knelt and moved one of the boxes aside, revealing a square piece of flooring that didn't quite match the rest. Newer wood, no wear. A patch job, sloppy. He wedged his fingers into the seam and lifted. The panel came up clean. Underneath was a narrow space, not deep, just wide enough for someone to hide something they wanted to be found only by someone looking with their hands instead of their eyes. Inside, wrapped in old cloth, was a flash drive. Boone sat back. Nolan didn't move for a long time. The cloth smelled faintly of tobacco and cologne. His father's. Boone rested his paw on Nolan's boot. A gentle tap, as if to say, "It's time." Later, in his cruiser parked beneath the trees on the edge of Wallowa Lake, Nolan plugged the drive into the encrypted tablet issued by the department. He didn't want to access it from home. Too many unknowns. The screen flickered once, then loaded. There were 3 folders, one labeled Contracts, one Photos, and one, simply, Doubt. He opened the last one. Inside, a video, no timestamp, no title, just grainy footage of a warehouse floor, men loading crates marked with nothing but serial numbers, a voice in the background muttering names Nolan couldn't make out. Then, a face turned briefly toward the camera. Familiar, local, connected. He closed the tablet slowly. Boone, seated in the passenger seat, stared out the window, his body still, but his ears were raised. He could smell it. Not fear, not even danger. Truth. And truth, once disturbed, doesn't settle quietly. The sun was gone again by the time Nolan pulled back into the driveway. Heavy clouds had thickened over Joseph like a lid slowly lowering onto a simmering pot. The house stood quiet beneath it, hunched beneath the weather. No lights on, no smoke from the chimney, but Boone didn't wait for the engine to cut. Before Nolan could reach for the keys, Boone was already upright in the passenger seat, shoulders locked, eyes fixed on the front porch. Nolan didn't ask. He opened the door. Boone jumped down without hesitation, landing in a low crouch before slowly rising, each step deliberate, as if the earth beneath his paws had changed while they were gone. Nolan followed, his boots crunching softly over gravel and damp leaves. The porch creaked the same way it always did, one groan beneath the third board, then another near the swing. But it didn't sound like home tonight. It sounded like it was trying to warn someone. He reached for the knob, still locked. He opened the door carefully, stepping inside with Boone pressed close to his leg. The house was dark except for the faint, flickering glow of the hearth, low and tired, as if the fire hadn't been tended in hours. But it was the stillness that stopped Nolan cold. It wasn't peaceful, it was too still, the kind that doesn't breathe. "Mom," he called, voice soft but steady. No answer. He stepped forward. Boone moved ahead, nose twitching. Not alarmed. Not relaxed either. The dog's tail was rigid, low, his body forming that in-between posture that meant he didn't like what he didn't smell. Nolan moved toward the living room, passing by the window. The drapes were half drawn. The teacup on the side table was untouched, but no longer warm. Then he saw it. Boone had stopped in the middle of the room, standing at a strange angle, facing the front door, but head turned toward the back hallway. He wasn't growling, not barking, just still, watching. Nolan stepped closer, and Boone's eyes flicked toward him with urgency. Not panic, warning. That's when Nolan realized. The back hallway was darker than it should have been. The nightlights his mother always kept plugged in, the one with the ceramic mountain goat, and the other shaped like a hummingbird, were off, unplugged. He moved faster now, hand brushing past the coat rack, down the hall, Boone pressed tight behind him. At the far end of the hallway, the guest room door stood open. Not wide, just enough. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, empty. He turned toward his mother's room. The door was closed. Boone stopped. And then, one sound. A faint breath from behind the door. Not hers. Nolan's pulse slowed to silence. He reached for the handle with one hand, the other brushing his side. No weapon, just breath and memory. The handle turned. Inside, his mother sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, back perfectly straight, as if she'd been posed. And behind her, half-shadowed near the closet, a figure stepped backward slowly, retreating toward the wall like smoke pulling into itself. He didn't shout, didn't move fast. Boone growled once, low and sharp, the kind of sound that makes the room smaller. The man stopped moving. Nolan stepped forward. "You need to leave," he said, voice flat. Not anger, not fear, just final. The figure didn't answer. His features were blurred by shadow, but his shape was clear. Tall, narrow shoulders, something in his right hand, not quite visible, not a weapon. A bag, a folder. He didn't lift it. He dropped it. The man stepped sideways toward the window. Boone lunged forward, teeth bared, but Nolan called him off with nothing but a glance. Too quiet, too sharp. Boone froze mid-motion. The window slid open without resistance. Whoever this was had done his research. He slipped out in one motion, vanished into the dark. Boone moved to the window immediately, paws on the sill, head craning toward the tree line. A soft rustle answered. Fading footsteps. Then nothing. Nolan turned to his mother. She hadn't cried, hadn't screamed, but her eyes were wide, her breath shallow. She gripped the edge of the blanket so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Did he hurt you?" Nolan asked. She shook her head. But he could tell. Something had changed. Something had been said. Nolan picked up what the man had dropped. A manila envelope. No name, no markings. Inside, a photograph. Nolan's father, standing outside the Millfield gates. Behind him, 3 other men, one circled in red, and a handwritten note. "He died for nothing if you stop now." Boone growled again. But this time Nolan didn't stop him. The morning came reluctantly. A pale sun pushed itself through a smear of cloud that hung low over the ridgeline, casting no warmth, only the faint sense that time hadn't stopped, after all. Nolan stood at the edge of the porch, holding the envelope in one hand, the photo in the other. He hadn't slept. Neither had Boone, who remained seated beside the front door, his body alert but still, eyes half-lidded like a soldier between orders. Inside the house, Marla moved softly, as if her body still held the echo of someone else's presence. The photo in Nolan's hand didn't shake. His fingers were steady, but something behind his sternum felt unmoored. He looked again at the face circled in red, a man with deep-set eyes and a jaw like a closing door. The backdrop of the image was unmistakable. The closed gates of Millfield Mill. His father stood just left of center, shoulders drawn back. But the look on his face wasn't pride. It was resignation. Or maybe resolve. Nolan couldn't quite name it, but Boone looked at the photo, then back at him, and let out a low breath through his nose, like he knew exactly what it meant. The note was brief, but it kept replaying in Nolan's mind. "He died for nothing if you stop now." He folded the envelope slowly and tucked it inside his coat. Not because he agreed, but because ignoring it would have meant erasing what had already taken root. That afternoon, Nolan didn't go back to the station. He didn't file a report or call in a disturbance. What would he say? That a man had stepped out of the shadows, left behind a memory, and vanished. That a German shepherd had confirmed what the system refused to acknowledge. Instead, he took Boone and drove to the cemetery on the hill above town. There was no ceremony, no flowers, just wind and the steady hum of Boone's breath in the back seat. The gravel crunched beneath the cruiser's tires until it stopped beside a familiar oak, tall, split down one side by lightning decades ago. Boone jumped down without needing to be called. He knew where they were. He knew why. The headstone was modest. No titles, just a name. Benjamin Briggs. And 2 dates carved so cleanly they looked like they'd been typed. Boone walked ahead, then sat, not beside the grave, but just in front of it, facing Nolan, as if keeping space for something sacred. Nolan didn't speak at first. He sat on the low stone bench beside the grave, pulled the folded letter from his pocket. Not the one from the envelope, but one he'd found years ago tucked inside an old book of sermons in his father's study. He hadn't read it in years, not until last night. He opened it now. "Marla, I think they'll try to shut this down before anyone hears about it. Maybe even before the paper gets a chance to print anything. I'm not a crusader. I never was. But I've seen the ledgers. I've seen what they buried. I've seen what it cost those families down by the south fence. I just need to know you and Nolan will be okay. If anything happens, it wasn't an accident. Teach him to look closer. He sees things even when he doesn't want to. He'll know what to do. Love you both. Ben." Nolan's thumb rested against the word "look." He didn't blink. Boone inched closer, head low, ears flattened, not out of fear, but reverence. Nolan looked down at him, let the silence stretch, then reached over and scratched Boone behind the ear. Just once. "You kept us safe," he said quietly. Boone blinked. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry grasses around the headstone, kicking up old pine needles that had drifted across the grave. Nolan stood, folded the letter slowly, and placed it beneath a flat stone next to the marker. It wasn't meant to be hidden. It wasn't meant to be found by anyone else either. On the way back down the hill, Boone sat up straighter. His ears twitched twice, and Nolan saw what he was hearing just a moment later. A car parked half a mile down the slope, engine running, a man inside watching from behind the wheel. Not the same one from the night before. Younger, dressed plain, but not lost, not waiting for directions. Nolan didn't stop the car. He didn't wave. He just drove past. But Boone's head turned slowly as they passed, following the vehicle with the same look he'd given the circled face in the photo. No sound, no growl, just the weight of understanding between them. Back home, Nolan didn't say anything to Marla. She had already made 2 cups of tea, one for him, one for her, and had placed a third ceramic bowl, Boone's, on the floor beside the fire. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon, like someone had finally lit a candle she'd been saving since last fall. That evening, when the mail came, it was thin. One flyer, a local circular, and a letter addressed to Nolan with no return address. He opened it slowly at the kitchen table. Inside was a name and an address, a journalist, retired, once sued for defamation by Millfield in the early 2000s, lost the case, never wrote again. Underneath the address, one line: "Not everyone forgets." Boone nudged Nolan's leg beneath the table, then curled up with his head resting across both of Nolan's boots, just as he had since the first night they'd met. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, slow and soundless. They would visit that address tomorrow. But tonight, they would sit in the quiet. And that would be enough. The road to Enterprise wound like a question through the pines, each curve brushed with early snow that hadn't yet stuck. The town looked like it had been carved out of quiet. An old theater with letters missing from the marquee, a single cafe with steamed-up windows, a bookstore with a "Back in 10" sign taped crookedly to the door. Nolan pulled the cruiser to a stop 2 blocks from the address on the envelope. Boone shifted in the passenger seat, his body angled forward, ears flicking at the sound of distant traffic that barely broke the stillness. The house was older than most. 2 stories, weather-gray siding, porch sagging slightly in the middle like it had breathed too deeply once and never recovered. An American flag hung motionless from the post near the stairs, faded to soft blues and pinks, but still there. Boone waited until Nolan opened the door before jumping down, nose lifted to the air, then lowered again. They approached together, no urgency, no hesitation. Nolan knocked once, no answer. Then the door opened a fraction, not wide enough to see a face, but enough to feel someone behind it. "I'm not buying anything," a voice rasped. Male, tired. Nolan held up the envelope. "You used to write things people tried to bury," he said simply. A pause. Then the door opened, just enough for one eye, one cheekbone, and a shadow of a man to be visible. White hair grown long, tucked behind his ears, a flannel shirt with holes along the collar. He studied Nolan for a long moment. His gaze dropped to Boone. Something in him softened just slightly. "Come in," he muttered, "but if you've got a wire on you, it stays outside." Inside, the house was a shrine to paper. Stacks of manila folders, clippings, yellowed pages covered every flat surface. The air smelled like old ink and wood smoke. Boone stayed close, tail low, watching every corner like a soldier clearing a room. The man, Nolan only now noticed the name etched into a rusting brass plaque on the wall, Errol Mercer, pointed to the couch without sitting himself. Nolan handed over the USB and the photo. He said nothing more. Errol held them in hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but something deeper. Memory, maybe, or the ache of recognition. After a long silence, he exhaled. "Millfield buried their ledgers before they buried your father," he said. Voice quiet. "They used the press to smear anyone who asked the wrong questions. I was the wrongest of them all." Nolan didn't respond. He didn't need to. Boone circled once before sitting between them, gaze shifting from man to man. Errol leaned back, eyes closed. "You think they'll let it surface now?" he asked. "I don't care what they let," Nolan said. The room settled into stillness. Errol opened his eyes. "I lost a lot doing this once," he said. "My marriage, my name. You bring me this, and you're asking if I want to lose the last of what's left?" Nolan reached into his coat and pulled out the letter. His father's. He didn't hand it over, just opened it on the table, turned it toward Errol, and tapped the words, "He died for nothing if you stop now." Errol's fingers hovered above the page but never touched. Then he nodded, just once, and that was all. When Nolan left, the wind had picked up. The pine needles whispered low things Boone seemed to understand. They drove back without the radio, without a word. Boone lay with his head across the console, one paw resting gently against Nolan's thigh. Not pressing, just present. A week passed. Snow came heavier now, clinging to the porch railings like old promises. Marla moved a little more freely through the house, baking again. Small things at first. Cornbread, cinnamon toast. Rolls that didn't rise but made the kitchen smell like they had. She didn't ask about the photo, or the man, or the memory folded back into Nolan's coat pocket. She simply added an extra cup of tea to the table some mornings, as if expecting the truth to show up eventually. Then came the envelope. Plain, mailed from Portland. No return address. Inside, a single news clipping. Headline bold, unapologetic. Whistleblower records spark reopening of Millfield financial fraud investigation after 18 years. Below it, no mention of Nolan. No mention of Errol. Just 3 names under investigation. Names that matched the ones circled in his father's files. Justice didn't have a voice, but it had a direction now. And that was enough. That afternoon, Boone was honored during a quiet ceremony at the Wallowa County Sheriff's Office. Not for bravery, not for attack, but for awareness. For reading a room before the humans in it could. For sensing danger not from noise, but from absence. For being there and staying. Nolan didn't speak at the ceremony. He stood beside Boone as others shook hands and clapped backs. When they tried to place a small medal around the dog's neck, Boone shook once, stepped back, and sat down beside Nolan's boot. So Nolan knelt, cupped Boone's face gently, and whispered, "You don't need medals." Boone blinked slowly. "You just need to keep watching." That night, back home, the stars came out for the first time in a while, and Nolan realized that silence wasn't absence. It was presence, holding its breath until someone was ready to hear. The snow had melted in patches by the time November bled into December, leaving the yard patchy with wet leaves and frost-crusted soil. The wind no longer howled. It whispered, drifting through the pine needles and across the porch swing that creaked in slow motion, as if remembering some long-forgotten rhythm. Inside the cabin, the air held warmth again, not just from the fire that crackled in the hearth, but from the scent of baked apples cooling on the counter, from the sound of Boone's paws padding softly across the wooden floor, from the presence of people who no longer moved around each other like ghosts. Marla stood at the sink, not washing anything in particular, just turning a mug in her hands, the same one Nolan had given her 10 years ago when she first retired. It was chipped now, stained on the rim, but she kept it because it felt familiar. Boone lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, eyes tracking the way the light shifted through the kitchen window. He didn't move when the front door opened. He didn't need to. It was Nolan returning from his shift, not late, not early, just when he was supposed to. That in itself was new. Nolan shrugged off his coat, hung it by the door. The house didn't feel like a place he visited anymore. It felt like something he had slowly come home to. He walked into the kitchen and took 2 mugs from the rack, hers and his, and filled both with hot water, dropping in the tea bags without speaking. He slid hers across the counter with the ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times. Marla smiled faintly, but said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It no longer held the weight of avoidance. It held understanding. Something tender passed back and forth without words. Then Nolan placed a 3rd cup on the floor beside Boone. It wasn't really a cup, just a small ceramic bowl with a chip on the side. Boone raised his head, ears twitching. Nolan poured a small splash of warm broth inside. Not much, just enough for the ritual. Boone sniffed it, licked once, and rested his head back down, satisfied. The moment wasn't about the broth. It never had been. It was about acknowledgement. One for him, one for her. One for the dog who had never stopped standing guard even when no one asked him to. On the small TV mounted under the cabinet, the evening news murmured on, mostly noise, until a headline rolled across the bottom in white block letters. Millfield investigation reopened after 18 years. No photos, no names, just confirmation that the wheel had turned again, slow but deliberate, and someone somewhere had listened. Nolan didn't look up. Neither did Marla, but she reached across the counter and laid her hand over his, just the weight of her fingers resting on the back of his hand like it used to when he was small and anxious before school. Boone's eyes stayed closed, but his tail swept the floor once in a low arc. They sat like that for a long time, the fire hissing softly, the clock ticking just loud enough to remind them that time was still moving. Outside, the first breath of evening settled over the porch. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, pine, and the last clinging memory of fall. Nolan stood finally, walked to the front door, and opened it slowly. The yard was empty, quiet. Just the swing creaking in the breeze and the old maple tree swaying gently at the edge of the property. Beyond that, the woods pressed in, dark, familiar, unchanged. Boone followed, standing just behind him, and leaned gently into Nolan's hip. Not asking, just reminding. Nolan stepped out onto the porch and stood for a moment, breathing in the stillness. Then he turned back toward the living room, picked up an old blanket from the arm of the couch, and draped it across his mother's shoulders, where she now sat in her rocker, eyes closed, not asleep, just resting. He didn't speak. Just knelt beside her, let his head rest lightly against her knee the way he had as a boy, not to be comforted, but to offer comfort. And Boone lay beside them both, one paw touching Nolan's boot, tail curled around himself like a question finally answered. The wind came again, not strong, just enough to rattle the last leaves clinging to the tree outside. The porch swing moved a little faster. Somewhere in the distance, a single crow called once and was silent. Nolan looked out into the dusk and saw nothing unusual, nothing out of place, and yet everything had shifted. Justice hadn't come loudly. It had come like Boone, quiet, persistent, present. It had waited. It had watched. And when it was time, it had stepped forward without asking for applause. Inside, the fire dimmed, Boone lifted his head once more, let out a soft huff, then lay back down, his head on Nolan's boot like always. 3 cups, 3 breaths, and wind through what remains. If you've ever sat quietly and felt someone's presence without them speaking, if you've known the kind of loyalty that doesn't ask questions, only stays. If silence has ever meant more to you than words, then you already understand. Type Amen if you believe some truths don't need to be shouted, they just need to be held. And tell us, when was the last time someone stayed without needing to be asked? Some truths never needed shouting, some heroes never wore medals, and sometimes the greatest acts of love happen when no one is watching, in the quiet click of a door locking for the night, the weight of a dog's head resting on your boot, or a mother placing a 3rd cup of tea for someone who never left. Boone never needed words. Nolan never needed thanks. They simply stayed. Through fear, through silence, through the ache of unfinished stories. If you've ever felt the healing power of someone who didn't leave, even when they could have. If you've known a dog who stood between you and the dark, not because they were told, but because they just knew. And tell us, has there ever been a moment in your life when silence spoke louder than words? We'd love to read your story in the comments. Sometimes your story becomes the lifeline someone else is quietly searching for.